Over to
Okay.
you.
Okay, thank you. So when I was asked if I could do the webinar, I was asked what topic to talk about and was basically given a blank slate. So I decided to just go off personal experience and look at my coaching journey and how that has been impacted throughout the women's game, especially, and just to see the transformation of the women's game from when I first started being a coach within it to what it looks like now, both from working in England and making the move across the pond to the US. And then just very briefly about my current role and how that's a little bit different. And it's quite apt really that Anson and Randy were on previously to me, because they are a big part of what my current role looks like. So that's sort of where the webinar is going to go, and I'll be conscious of the 8 p.m. time to make sure that I don't chuck into that, because I think applauding the NHS is fantastic. So I'll get started. So just very briefly, this is my coaching journey in terms of who I've had the pleasure of working for, and I'll go into more detail on what this looks like and what role I had within these different organisations. But I wanted to talk about real quickly, because I think for a lot of people, we see the women's game now in a very different light to what it was when I first started in my career. When I first started in my career and I graduated from university, I was working part-time at Birmingham City doing the Centre of Excellence, and then got a full-time position through the men's team, working for Birmingham City Ladies as the Centre of Excellence Director, and then transitioned into becoming the head coach. But at this time, the league itself from the women's side was completely part-time. The players were part-time and all the members of staff were part-time. We had very limited resources and funding. We trained a maximum of 3 times a week, often at 8 p.m. at night after everyone had finished work. It was very semi-pro amateur style Sunday league at the time, but we were competing at the highest level of the women's game with senior international players in our team, and also trying to produce younger players for the youth national teams in England at the time. And then in 2008, while I was working in Birmingham, I actually was working part-time with the English FA, working at the youth national team level. And that commitment at the time meant that I had to make a decision to move away from Birmingham, because I couldn't commit the way I wanted to do the women's team and also continue my pathway coaching-wise to continue doing the England youth stuff. So I made a decision to step away from Birmingham and got a phone call from Arsenal asking me to go down and be assistant coach there. So I made that decision, and that decision was a huge one at the time, because I travelled from Birmingham to London for training. And then again, I transitioned from being the assistant coach into being the head coach within 1 season. But again, at the time, a very part-time mentality. We had more funding and more access to resources than we did when I was at Birmingham. But again, we trained 3 times a week. But a big challenge that we had at Arsenal in comparison to Birmingham at the time was not only did we not have to try and compete with the best teams in our country, but we were also competing with the Champions League teams around Europe. And a lot of the bigger clubs around Europe, Lyon at the time, Frankfurt at the time, and a lot of the German clubs and Swedish clubs had actually transitioned into full-time environments where they were training a lot more than we were. The players had access to more things than what we currently did. And we were very restricted in what we could do. Arsenal as a football club were very accommodating in trying to make it work for us, but we were still very much a part-time club working around part-time hours. And then in 2011, while I was at Arsenal, the FA decided to create a Women's Super League, which is still in existence now, but very different than what it looked like in 2011. The WSL was transformed to run through the spring and summer, and one of its aims was to try to not compete from a fan base with the men's game. it tried to add checks and balances to clubs so that we could actually try and move into a more full-time position with players earning more money and us getting more resources, especially from a sports science perspective. The game definitely evolved itself on that level. And we definitely tried to find a more professional environment for the players to play in. Again, I think one of the reasons for this was so that the women's national team could try and compete at a higher level. But also from a club perspective, knowing what was happening in Europe to try and also compete. But again, at this time, when the WSL first came around, not many players were full-time. It just gave them enough money to be able to restrict the amount of other work that they had to do around being a high-level athlete. And then in 2016, I'd left England by this point, but the FA announced that they were going to move the FA WSL back to being a winter league. In 2017-18, it ran in its winter format. And then in 2018-19, so 7 years on from when the WSL was first formed, the league was fully professional, with 12 teams competing in it in the highest tier. And it also has promotion and relegation. And for the US fans out there or coaches out there, that's a very different platform to what is available to players in this country. And in 2012, at the end of 2012, sorry, I'll go back on that. At the end of 2012, I actually got a phone call. I was sat watching Hollyoaks on my sofa in Birmingham, and I got a phone call from Seattle asking me if I wanted to be the head coach and general manager of a team that I'd never heard of in a league that I'd never heard of. And decided that I thought it might be a fun thing to do. And this was, for me as a coach, it was a massive change and turning point in my career, really, because it was the first time I was working with players who were full-time professionals, and having a staff whose main job was to work for the team meant that we could take the players' environment on a different level to what I'd been able to do before. And I was able to look back and lean on the experiences that I'd had at youth national team level in regards to what I felt we needed as a club to be able to function at the highest possible level. So access to sports science, access to video analysis stuff.
Laura, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, you can probably hear the clapping in my street coming outside, actually. So we'll just leave it on your screen so you can crack straight on. But yeah, just for a little pause. Thanks for that, Laura. Sorry about that. I was getting some funny looks hanging out my window doing the clap.
No problem.
Really appreciate that pause. And again, feel free to extend, like Erez is next, but Erez is, thankfully, we'd rather hear from you than Erez. No offense to Erez.
No, it's fine. Don't worry too much. I won't take up too much time, honestly. So back to taking the reign job. I think it was the NWSL were just formed. The club was brand new. We didn't have a cone, but we could create it into what we wanted it to be. And I really lent on my experiences that I'd had from the youth national team set up, seeing what that level of environment could look like, and lent on my experiences from working in the Champions League and seeing what a full-time environment could look like. And since leaving Arsenal and Birmingham, obviously their pathways and their environments have dramatically changed since I left. So going back and seeing the evolution of what those clubs now can offer players just shows that the level of what the women's game has developed just throughout my career is pretty unrecognisable from what it was when I left, which was 7 years ago now, which is crazy. But I think just to even see where the NWSL has gone on has been massive. So I think one thing that is so dramatically different in England to working in the US, especially at club level, is the travel and logistics that go into being able to run the league and the cost of what that is, and how far out in advance you have to plan everything. Every single game we had with the rain and with my next job at Utah was a flight, or the minimum drive on a coach when we were at the rain was like 3 hours to Portland. They were our local rival, if you want to call it that, it's obviously such a dramatic difference than what I was used to back in England, where going from London to the northeast was the longest journey that we ever had to do, and you probably had to do that once a season. We're doing this every single week. So again, leaning on my experiences from Champions League and knowing the logistics that we had to go through to organise those games and prepare the players for those games, made my transition into working out in the US in the professional league a little bit more seamless. But I think the big challenge was that it was a blank sheet of paper, not only from the Rain itself being a brand new club, but the league was brand new too. So everything was new. Everything was a first. And then in 2018, I decided to make another decision to take a head coaching job staying within the league at Utah Royals. And this was a different challenge from a coaching perspective, and opened up even different pressures and different environments to me, because we were fully integrated with the men's team in the MLS. The owner was very adamant that he wanted the women's and the men's team to be treated very equally. We both played in the stadium, 20,000 seat stadium in Salt Lake City. When he bought the team in the November and I took the job in the December, I think, by the February, he'd purpose-built a brand new locker room that didn't exist when he first bought the team. So the investment that he put in and the structure there was this massive influx of staff that were available to me that hadn't been available to me at the Rain, because we were a single entity club without the men's equivalent within our team. Whereas with Utah, there was so many more people that wanted to be part of making our club be successful. So from a coaching perspective, having to open your eyes up to what that could look like was a massive challenge. And again, having a purpose-built locker room just for the women's team was a massive change for me. I'd never seen that before within a men's team. And we had our own training facility that only the women's team used. It wasn't accessed by the men. We were very integrated. If we needed to use their facility or they used ours, it was a complete equal conversation, which I just wasn't used to. I hadn't had that before. And that just was a real eye-opener to me, that the women's game was taking strides in the right direction from what we've always wanted it to look like. So for those that aren't overly aware of what the NWSL is or how it was formed in 2012 after the Olympics, when the US won gold. I think it was seen as something that post that celebration of the US winning gold, that US Soccer had a conversation with everyone, all the stakeholders within the game, to say that at a professional level that women needed somewhere to play within the States, and not just rely on other countries outside of the US to give them a platform. So in 2013, we had the inaugural season. It was the third attempt at a professional league in the US. There was the WUSA early in the 2000s and the WPS, which was around 2009, 2010. Both financially couldn't sustain themselves. So the NWSL was the first league in the US that had been subsidized by US Soccer, with the owners as well. And now it's the most sustainable professional women's soccer league that's existed in the US, and it's now entering its 8th season. Hopefully, obviously, in the current climate, whenever it starts, it will be entering its 8th season. One of the big differences with the NWSL in comparison to leagues back in Europe is that the minimum age for a player of any country to play in the NWSL is 18. So when I was looking at this and preparing this presentation to talk to you guys about, I thought it'd be interesting to look at some players that around the markets where they currently play. So we've got a lot of teams here in different markets, and you can see the landscape of the league across the United States. The 9 teams that have their own logo. On the West Coast, you've got Olympic Reign, which was my old team, Seattle Reign, got investment from Olympic Lyon this past year. Portland Thorns, who hold the record for the highest attendance, sell out their stadium every week. And then you come inland to Utah, which was the team that I just left. And then obviously a lot more teams as you go towards the east, with Houston and Chicago, Washington Spirit, Sky Blue, which are based in New Jersey and have just found a new stadium with New York Red Bull, North Carolina Courage, local to Anson, and down in the southeast with Orlando Pride. And then you'll see that one with the NWSL sign with Louisville, who committed to be part of the league in 2021. So there's currently 9 teams, but with Louisville, there would be a confirmed 10 teams. And out of the 23 players that were in the Women's World Cup roster that won the World Cup in 2019, all 23 of them played in the NWSL. So it's definitely had an impact on where players choose to take their pathway in the US currently. So yeah, going back to what I said before, I thought it would be interesting to look at the impact that the NWSL has had to date on US players. And again, I think it was apt that Randy and Anson were on before me, really, because I think the pathway for players in this country post-college, Anson touched on it in regards to the 91 World Cup team, that they didn't really have anywhere to go or a organised place to play. And I think the NWSL has provided a pathway post-college soccer for them. It's also given players an option that don't necessarily want to take the collegiate route, that when they get to 18, they could actually choose not to go to college and come into the NWSL. There's been a couple of examples of that recently. Some players who've chose not to go to college at all. Some players who've gone to college for a few years and then left early out of college. So it's just changed the decision-making that players can make. I think one of the things that it's added for all the players in this country at the highest level is that it's given them 20 to 24 competitive games per year that they weren't accessing before. A high-level training environment across the league, and a very, very competitive league. I think it's unique in its competitiveness, that the top team, North Carolina Courage, over the last couple of seasons, can be beaten by the 9th team in the league. And if you turn up to a game and your performance level is a 6 out of 10, the realities of you winning a game are small. If both teams turn up and give 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, it's going to be a really, really competitive game, and there will be a winner, but who that might be, it could be a flick of a coin. The competitive level between the league is so high that it really provides players with a pathway to develop. I think alongside that, the training environments that across the league are high level, with good facilities for the players to utilise. Throughout the league's evolution since 2013, the amount of contact days that we have with the players has gradually increased. But it's been gradual. So when we first started, I think the season ran between March as a pre-season and ended at the end of August. And now it's March as a pre-season ending end of October going into November. So gradually it's increasing. And for those that don't know, the drastic change in weather, especially on the East Coast, means that it's really difficult to play outside on grass or any surface really between the months of December, January, February for in a lot of the markets. So those sort of months are always going to be months that we would find very difficult to play games. And again, just touching back on, in the 2019 World Cup winning roster for the US, all of those players were playing domestically in the NWSL. So I decided to, when I was going through this, I just decided to look at a few players who have been impacted, I think, by the NWSL. And I think even my own personal view prior to really going into depth into this was a lot of players who play in England, high level players, and I use Steph Houghton as an example here, will have way more club appearances than what a US player has. And you can see just from this, Tobin and Steph are actually born in the same year. Tobin has more US caps, and I think that's relevant to the fact that the US play, especially early before the NWSL, play a lot of games that aren't necessarily in FIFA windows, and would do that a lot when the league didn't exist to supplement the players' playing opportunity. Whereas I think in Europe, we pretty much stick to the UEFA or FIFA windows so that the clubs could still have the players. But if you look at the club appearances for Tobin and the club appearances for Steph, with 117 appearances club-wise for Tobin and 220 plus for Steph, I couldn't even get the exact figure. The difference is dramatic. But if you look at the age that they both started playing professional, probably Steph wasn't professional the whole time, club appearances is a dramatic difference. But if you actually look at the club appearances that they've had since 2013, I think it just shows the impact that the NWSL has had, because it just provides a platform. And just again, touching on college for a moment, I think that age group between 18 and 22, where Steph was playing games for Leeds United or Sunderland or Arsenal, whatever club she was at the time, Tobin was attending UNC with Anson and played 90 games in that period. So she would have been playing games. It just might not have been at club level. But the collegiate system is such a massive part of the USA pathway that it's something that would still stand within what the players get access to. And I think the other element is that at the time, in 2002, female players in the UK could play adult football at 14. It's now 16. So it's still a little bit younger than what players can play adult football in this country. So the pathways are a little bit different. I also then looked at two younger players and the impact that they've had. So Mallory Pugh and Georgia Stanway from England. Georgia Stanway is actually a year younger than Mal. Mal actually chose not to go to college and went into the professional game at 18 and has had 40 appearances since then. And Georgia is at Man City, and at the age of 16, started her Man City career and has had 55. So still she's had more exposure to games. I think Mal's actually been a little bit injured in that period of her club appearance opportunities. But you can see that the pathways are still pretty similar. And I think that's a big indicator to the impact that the NWSL has had, is it's just provided a platform that runs in a similar line to what is offered in Europe, which I think over time we could see something that would provide us with some good data. And then I think just starting to give a little bit of depth to that college system for those that don't know too much about it is within the US, there's 335 Division I women's soccer programs that functioned in 2019, 2020. They function under the NCAA, and I think Randy touched on that before, and that's their governing body. So they have to be compliant with the rules that they provide, and they're not necessarily equivalent to FIFA rules. So they have a little bit of a different rule in regards to how substitutions happen. They're a lot more flexible in that. A big reason for that is they play a lot of games in a short amount of time. And Randy and Anson touched on it before, that there's big discussions around that. There's something within college, NCAA especially, called Title IX, which means that colleges have to look at men's and women's sports equally. So if there's a numerical amount of men playing sport and being funded to play sport in a college, then there has to be an equivalent of women's side. And with basketball and American football being such big sports in this country, women's soccer is a good program for schools to have that help with the female numbers. So it's a huge advantage for some women's soccer programs to have access to really good facilities and things within big schools that the players can get access to. Currently, they play competitively in the fall, which is between August and December. They have a spring season, but it only allows 5 days of competition in that time. It's a heavy game schedule in the fall with limited training opportunities. But outside of the full, the training opportunities are higher, but there is a little bit of a restriction in the amount of contact time that coaches can have with athletes. But it provides players with access to soccer opportunities whilst also being able to achieve a degree. And I think the fact that there's 335 Division 1 programs in the country just shows how vast the country is, for one. It's so huge. But secondly, just how many opportunities there are for female athletes who want to play at a good level and continue their soccer on post 18. There is the professional route that could be taken if education isn't something that you want to do, or you want to take that different route from a soccer perspective. But also it shows that there is a huge opportunity for players to gain access to soccer programs throughout the US that will help them to provide them with also gaining an education, which I think could be vital. I think that lends into the challenge that I have in my new role. So for the US national team U20s, out of the recent 20-player roster that I had at our qualification for the U20 World Cup, which we qualified for, which was great, I had one professional player, 4 players who were under the age of 18 who hadn't gone to college yet, and I had 15 players who were at D1 college programs. So you can see that the majority of the players in my age category currently attend colleges. So I think within my role, the new challenge that I have is to try and use the experience that I've got of working in the professional game to help the players on the field and off the field in terms of their personal development, but building relationships with the college coaches, such as Randy, such as Anson, and all the other coaches that have players who are in our program, because they have so much access to them and so much access to really high level facilities. And in some cases, medical, video analysis, sports science stuff, that I think building the relationships with them to make sure that we provide the players with the best pathway for them individually is the biggest role and biggest challenge that I have in this new role. And it's interesting to me to see all the different pathways that different players choose to take, in which can decide what their individual career could look like. And I think right now in the women's game, it's changed so dramatically from when I first was involved as a head coach in 2006 to 2020, that I can't wait to see what the women's game looks like in another 10, 15 years' time. And I know we're in a very unique period that no one's ever lived through before. But I think even webinars like today and everything else that's going on within the women's game, and the huge occasions like the Women's World Cup a year ago just show, I think, where the women's game is going. And that was pretty much everything I had.
Brilliant.
So thank you.
Thank you for that, Laura. Really insightful. Really enjoyed that as well. I'll have to thank Andy Gard again for recommending you to speak. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And it must be strange, going into that new role now, and obviously this happening. So is there any way that you're trying to manage and look after those players at the minute, or is it a case of they look after themselves through their respective organisations?
Yes, it's been a little bit of both. We were lucky that we did our qualification right before COVID really broke out globally. We just managed to finish the tournament and get everyone home safely. So that was a positive for us, because then we sort of knew that we'd qualify for the World Cup, but when the World Cup might happen is obviously out of our hands. So it meant that the players were sort of in a period when this first hit, that they'd done the big event that we needed them to do straight away, but they were going back into their college programs potentially. And then obviously the change for that was that they didn't go back into their college programs or club programs, but they started to do online classes. Their college coaches were reaching out and providing them with things to do. So we sort of took a little bit of a backseat with this age group, but as the weeks have gone on, we've definitely been reaching out to them to make sure that individually, if they need anything, that we're here to help. And honestly, one of my biggest things that I've taken out of this time is to try and build those relationships with the coaches that have access to a lot of the players in my current pool, and just talk to them and learn from them a little bit. Someone like Anson, I think from Anson's program in my current pool, I think we had 3 players who are currently with Anson, and then another 2 players who are going to be with Anson in August. So I've spoken to him quite a few times just on, things that we see about players, and is there anything that we can do to help them, and trying to do it as more of an integrated thing rather than Anson going off and doing the great stuff that he does, and then us as a federation going off and doing something else with the players. Just trying to integrate it more together, I think, has been the biggest thing that I've been looking at trying to do to help these kids.
That's great to hear, and it's great to hear those kind of things going on, especially with the unfortunate news of what's happened in the States today as well. But no, it's great to hear that there's those good relationships being built between the national team and the colleges and the clubs as well, and even high schools as well. I didn't realise you'd had high school players still come into the age group as well.
Mm-hmm.
No, again, thank you very much, Laura. Really appreciate